A leopard cub, abandoned and crying in the middle of a savage jungle, circled by a hungry pack of hyenas, with no mother in sight. Just when death seemed inevitable, something happened that left wildlife experts completely stunned. A massive, silverback gorilla stepped in, but what he did after the rescue, no one was prepared for. This is not just a story of survival, it's about an impossible bond, forged in the heart of the wild. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. At dawn, the eastern fog rolled slowly over the treetops of the Nyangani highlands. A soft drizzle clung to the leaves, and the forest, usually alive with birdsong, was strangely quiet. But beneath the silence, something stirred, something small, fragile, and lost. A leopard cub, barely 5 weeks old, dragged his weak limbs through the wet underbrush. His coat, once golden with black rosettes, was now slicked with mud and tangled leaves. His tiny whiskers twitched, and from his throat came soft, broken mews. He was hungry, cold, alone. His mother hadn't returned. 2 nights earlier, she had not come back from her nightly hunt. She had been strong, quick, and careful, but not careful enough. Somewhere beyond the trees, in the shadow of a poacher's trap, she had taken her final breath. And the cub had waited and waited. Now hunger gnawed at him. His legs trembled. Each step was heavier than the last. He paused under the twisted roots of an old fig tree, trying to curl up and hide. But the scent of blood, fear, and vulnerability had already betrayed him to the jungle. From the ferns, movement. 4 pairs of yellow eyes blinked into view, low, cunning, patient. A pack of hyenas, lean and silent, crept closer. They didn't laugh. Not yet. They were focused, circling the cub like smoke. One of them let out a growl that rumbled through the grass. The cub, sensing the danger, turned and tried to retreat. His paws slipped in the wet earth. He gave a sharp, panicked cry. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. That's when the jungle shifted. A sound like thunder cracked through the trees, not from the sky, but from the ground. Something massive was approaching. Birds burst upward from the canopy. Leaves trembled. Even the hyenas froze. From between the vines, a giant emerged. Bantu. A lone silverback gorilla, powerful and reclusive, known by rangers but rarely seen. His chest rose and fell like a drum, and his dark eyes locked instantly onto the scene. The cub, cornered. The hyenas, closing in. With no hesitation, Bantu let out a deep, guttural roar and charged. The hyenas scattered. One tried to dart toward the cub, but Bantu swung a heavy branch in one brutal arc, slamming it to the ground. Then silence. Rain dripped. Bantu turned to the trembling cub. He didn't touch him, not yet. He simply sat beside him in the mud and watched. The cub, too weak to flee, lay there, not understanding. But somehow he no longer cried. He wasn't alone anymore, and that would change everything. Bantu stayed with the cub long after the hyenas had vanished into the mist. The gorilla's massive frame sat still, like a statue carved from obsidian, eyes watching the trees, every muscle alert. Though the rain softened to a drizzle, the air remained tense, thick with the scent of wet earth and something new. A bond forming between two beings that, by nature as designed, should never have met this way. The cub, too young to understand the meaning of survival, curled into a shivering ball. His small sides heaved with every breath, too weak to stand, too tired to cry. Still, his eyes flicked toward Bantu, confused but not afraid. For some reason he couldn't grasp, this massive creature had saved him. and hadn't left. By midday, the jungle grew warm and damp. The sun broke through the clouds in streaks of gold. Bantu stood up briefly and lumbered into the trees. The cub blinked and whimpered, assuming he was alone again. But minutes later, Bantu returned, with something in his hand, a bunch of overripe figs plucked from the tree canopy. He sat cross-legged beside the cub and placed the fruit on a flat stone between them. He didn't eat, he just watched. The cub sniffed at them. His kind didn't eat figs, but hunger left no room for instinct. Slowly, he licked the sweet pulp. Then he bit into one, and another. It was messy, clumsy, but it kept him alive. In a ranger post miles away, a young biologist named Thomas Rourke was reviewing camera trap footage from the night before. What he saw made him sit upright in his chair, a frame showing a lone leopard cub surrounded by hyenas, and then, blurred by motion, the unmistakable shape of a gorilla charging through the frame. He replayed it 4 times, eyes wide. "Is that Bantu?" he muttered. He grabbed his bag, his boots, and a tranquilizer kit. If that truly was the elusive silverback, and he had intervened in a predator encounter with a leopard, then this wasn't just animal behavior. This was something else. Back in the jungle, the cub took a shaky step forward. Bantu shifted but didn't move away. Instead, he extended one long arm and gently brushed a leaf off the cub's head. The touch was surprisingly soft for such massive fingers, and in that moment, something changed. The cub, still fragile, pressed himself against the gorilla's leg and let out a sound. Not a growl, not a cry, just a sigh as if he could finally rest. Neither of them knew it yet, but rangers would soon come searching, and when they did, what they found would leave them, and the world, speechless. 2 days had passed since the first encounter. Deep in the jungle, under the shade of towering fig trees, Bantu continued to protect the leopard cub as if it were his own blood. The two slept side by side in the early mornings and moved through the forested slowly, the cub still gaining strength, learning to walk with less wobble. Sometimes Bantu would carry him in the crook of one arm when the terrain was too rough. The image was surreal, a massive gorilla nurturing a predator he should have feared. Meanwhile, Thomas Rourke pushed deeper into the forest with a ranger named Kamari, a quiet man who had grown up just outside the edge of the Highland Preserve. Kamari had heard legends about Bantu, but a gorilla rescuing a leopard cub? That wasn't myth. That was impossible. And yet, the footage didn't lie. The forest grew denser. Camera traps had picked up blurry motion, not clear enough to verify, but enough to keep Tomas pushing. They set up new sensors, placed fruit as bait, and moved quietly. Then, as the sun dipped into late afternoon, a low rustle caught their ears. Tomas froze. Kamari raised his binoculars. There they were. In a sun-dappled clearing, Bantu sat beneath a mossy log. The leopard cub nestled against his arm like a house cat. Tomas's breath caught. He reached for his camera, slowly, deliberately. The sound of the shutter was almost sacrilegious in the silence of the scene. They didn't dare approach, they just watched. Back in the clearing, the cub perked his ears but didn't move. Bantu looked up and spotted the humans watching from the brush. He stared at them, unflinching, not with fear but with warning. He made no aggressive movement, just a steady, powerful gaze that said, "He's under my protection." Kamari whispered, "Kize, he knows what he's doing." Tomas nodded slowly. "I think he does." They backed away. The story, however, was no longer theirs to keep. That night, Thomas uploaded a single image to the reserve's private research network. The gorilla cradling the cub like a guardian. By morning, it had leaked. By noon, it had gone viral. News outlets from New York to Nairobi were scrambling to verify what they called the jungle miracle. Headlines exploded. Gorilla adopts leopard cub in the wild. Impossible friendship caught on camera. Nature breaks its own rules. But the most powerful reactions came from everyday people: parents, veterans, teachers, refugees, people who had been through loss, loneliness, and unexpected healing, and who saw something more than a wild encounter. They saw hope. And in the heart of the Nyangani forest, two beings who didn't understand the concept of fame, or species boundaries, or internet stardom, simply lay together in the quiet shade. But their peace would not last long, because nature always tests what it creates. 3 days later, the jungle began to change. The air thickened, the birds grew silent, even the insects seemed to hush, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Bantu sensed it first. He always did. Before the winds began howling, before the branches bent and snapped, before the sky turned to ash, he was already moving. Not fast, but with purpose. He scooped the cub gently in one arm and headed uphill toward a narrow cave known only to the oldest silverbacks, a place dry, hidden, and high enough to escape the wrath that was coming. By noon, the storm had arrived. The winds screamed through the canopy like wild spirits. Trees fell like matchsticks. Rivers overflowed. It wasn't just a tropical rain, it was a monsoon. A monster. In the valley below, the ranger station was being evacuated. Thomas and Kamari had returned to install a new remote camera when the skies turned. They barely had time to secure their equipment before the first wave of water crashed down the ridge. "This is bad," Kamari shouted over the roar. "Real bad." Tomas looked toward the highlands. His mind wasn't on himself. It was on them. Bantu, the cub. He knew the clearing where they'd last seen them would now be a torrent of mud and falling trees. Back in the cave, the cub huddled against Bantu's chest, eyes wide. Thunder cracked, shaking the mountain. The entrance to their shelter was blocked by thick roots and wet vines, but the water couldn't reach them here. Not yet. Outside, a different threat was rising. The storm had flushed every creature from their hiding places: snakes, boars, even rival gorillas. And further downslope, a pack of desperate hyenas, soaked and starved, followed a trail. Not the cub's, Bantu's. His scent, carried by the wind and rain, had reached the wrong ears. These weren't the same hyenas as before. They were hungrier, meaner, and they had no interest in respecting the unnatural bond of a gorilla and a leopard cub. At sunrise, when the storm finally passed, the forest was no longer the same. Trees were gone, trails erased, rivers redirected, but the scent, it was still there. The hyenas crept forward. Back in the cave, Bantu stirred. His eyes narrowed. His nostrils flared. He could hear them. He knew what this meant, and this time, they weren't going to run. The sun broke through the canopy like fire through smoke, casting long beams of gold across the soaked forest. Branches snapped under the weight of the night's fury. Steam rose from the ground. The jungle was quiet. Too quiet. But Bantu wasn't fooled. He stood at the entrance of the cave, body tense, fists clenched. His back shielded the cub, who crouched behind him, trembling but watching. The gorilla's breath was steady. His eyes scanned the trees. He could feel them now. Not just hear them. The hyenas were closing in. 5 of them. One by one, they appeared like ghosts through the foliage. Lean, soaked, eyes wild from hunger and desperation. This wasn't about territory anymore. This was about survival. And they had decided that the smallest, weakest thing they saw would be their prize, but Bantu wasn't moving. The lead hyena growled low, testing. Then, slowly, it crept closer. A second followed. The others circled wide, trying to flank. The cub whimpered, and that was the last sound the hyenas would hear without consequence. Bantu exploded forward with a roar so primal it echoed through the ridges. He slammed his fists into the ground, sending mud and leaves flying, and charged. The first hyena lunged, But Bantu was faster. He grabbed it midair, hurled it against a tree, and it didn't get up. The others scattered for a moment, unsure, but one of them, larger, older, lunged toward the cub. Bantu didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in 2 strides and intercepted it with his entire body. They tumbled into the mud, teeth and fists flying. The hyena clamped onto Bantu's shoulder, but the gorilla didn't scream. He grunted, twisted, and pinned the predator with one massive hand. Then he let out a sound no human had ever recorded, deep, ancient, a warning passed down through generations. And the hyenas fled. Every single one. The forest went still again. Blood dripped from Bantu's arm. He staggered, breathing heavily, and looked back toward the cave. The cub, still in place, eyes wide, didn't move until Bantu extended his hand. The cub took one step forward, then another, and pressed himself into Bantu's chest. High above, from a hidden tree camera still intact after the storm, the entire scene had been captured. The footage would reach the world within days. But for now, in the ruins of the storm-swept jungle, no one spoke of fame or science or miracles. Just one gorilla standing in the aftermath, and one leopard cub who chose to stay beside him. But the final chapter of their story had yet to be written. 3 days had passed since the attack. The forest was slowly returning to itself. Birds tentatively sang in the treetops, new shoots pushed through the soggy earth, and the paths once drowned by mud had begun to dry. But deep inside the jungle, in a hidden clearing shaded by ferns and ancient trees, a quiet miracle continued to unfold. Bantu lay beside a pool of still water, his arms stretched protectively around the leopard cub who now dozed peacefully against his chest. The wound on Bantu's shoulder, inflicted by the hyena's bite, had scabbed over. He moved slower now, tired. But he was alive. And more importantly, so was the cub. They had survived. Not just the hyenas, not just the storm, but nature's own design. The rules written into their blood, into instinct and fear. Somehow, against every law the jungle lived by, they had rewritten what was possible. And far away, someone was coming to witness it. Tomas Rourke had returned, not with tranquilizers, not with gear, but with silence and patience. This time, he didn't want to capture Bantu. He didn't even want to tag the cub. What he wanted was something deeper, something true. He wanted to understand. Kamari had led him back to the outer ridge, where they waited for hours, watching from a distance. And then, without warning, Bantu emerged from the trees, the cub trotting beside him, leaner but stronger, playful even. The gorilla paused as he spotted the humans, then sat down in the mud as if to say, "You see now." Tomas lifted his camera, not to document, but to honor. The footage he captured that day, of the gorilla and leopard cub side by side, not just surviving but living, would circle the globe in hours. It aired on every major news network. It flooded social media. People who had never cared about conservation, who had never even heard of the Nyangani Highlands, were moved to tears. In shelters, schools, hospitals, and living rooms, strangers cried. They weren't just watching two animals. They were watching healing, forgiveness, courage. They were watching something humanity itself had forgotten how to do, to protect the vulnerable, even when it wasn't your responsibility. In the weeks that followed, the cub began to thrive. He climbed trees, chased birds, pounced on fallen fruit. And though his kind would eventually need space, need territory, need solitude, he didn't want to leave Bantu. And Bantu never made him. But nature, for all its miracles, also moves forward. When the time came, the forest made a gentle decision. A young female leopard, orphaned by drought, wandered into the territory. The cub, now stronger, older, confident, noticed her. He followed. Not far, not yet, but something in him stirred. That night, under a full moon, the cub curled up beside Bantu one last time. He purred in his sleep, and in the early light of morning, he was gone. Bantu searched the forest, not in panic, not in grief, but in quiet recognition. The cub had grown, he had lived, and now he belonged to the wild again. But something in Bantu changed after that. He no longer avoided the ranger stations. He began to appear more often, sometimes just outside the camps, always watching, always alone, as if waiting, as if listening. And every once in a while, a spotted shadow would emerge from the trees, and the cub, now a young male in his prime, would sit across from Bantu in the fading light. Not as a son, not as a pet, but as something greater, a survivor, a friend, a bond that had outlived storms, predators, and the laws of the wild. And as Tomas watched them from a distance, heart full, he whispered, "They changed each other, and maybe they just changed the rest of us too." If this story inspired you, remember, compassion has no species. Courage isn't about size, it's about heart. And sometimes the wild teaches us the most human lessons of all. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who still believes in kindness, even in the darkest places. Because sometimes the jungle doesn't just survive, it heals, it transforms, and it remembers.